The Letters Beneath the Floorboards. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, thin, yellowed, and addressed in handwriting Eleanor Brooks hadn't seen in more than 40 years. She almost threw it away. At 68, unexpected letters rarely carried good news. Most of her mail now was medical bills, advertisements for stair lifts, or reminders that retirement savings never stretched as far as anyone promised. But something about the ink stopped her. It wasn't just familiar. It was personal. She sat at her kitchen table, hands trembling slightly, and turned the envelope over. No return address, just her name, Eleanor Brooks. Not Mrs. Brooks. Not Grandma. Just Eleanor, the way only one person used to write it. Daniel Hart, her first husband. The man everyone believed had abandoned her in 1983. The man she had spent decades trying to forget. She opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, and 5 words that made her heart stop. I never left you willingly. What she discovered next would change everything she believed about her past, her marriage, and the life she thought she had lived honestly. Eleanor lived alone in a modest ranch house outside Columbus, Ohio. The place felt smaller every year. Not because the walls moved, but because memories filled every corner. Her second husband, Frank, had passed away 3 years earlier after a quiet battle with lung disease. Their marriage had been steady, predictable, comfortable in the way long companionship often becomes. Her daughter Megan called once a week. Her son Caleb visited when work allowed. The grandchildren came for holidays, filling the house with noise that faded too quickly. Most mornings began the same way. Coffee, local news playing too loudly, and a long look at the empty chair across from her. But that morning was different, because the past had found her again. Daniel Hart wasn't just an old memory. He had been her entire world once. They married young, too young some people said, but they built a life quickly. He worked construction, she waited tables, and they dreamed about buying a small lake house someday. Then one day he disappeared. No warning, no goodbye, just silence. The town filled in the blanks with rumors. Gambling debts, another woman, trouble with the law. Eleanor never got answers. Only a divorce notice delivered months later by a stranger. She remarried years later, trying to rebuild stability for her children. And she told herself Daniel Hart was just a chapter that ended badly. Until now. The letter inside the envelope was short. Ellie, if you're reading this, it means I finally found the courage to tell you the truth. I didn't leave you. Someone made sure I couldn't come back. There are letters hidden under the floorboards of the old house on Maple Street. They were meant for you. Always. Daniel. Her breath caught. Maple Street. The house they had lived in together. The house she sold decades ago when the memories became too heavy. She stared at the paper, unsure whether to feel anger or curiosity. What letters? Why now? And why did a part of her feel like she had been lied to for half a lifetime? That afternoon, she called Megan. You remember the old house on Maple Street? Eleanor asked carefully. The one from before Dad? Megan replied. Yes. Eleanor hesitated. I might need to go there. Megan paused. Why would you want to go back after all these years? Eleanor didn't know how to explain it. Because how do you tell your daughter that the man she grew up believing was a ghost from the past might have left behind a truth strong enough to shake everything? I just need to check something, she said finally. The house looked smaller than she remembered. New paint covered the siding, and a child's bicycle leaned against the porch railing. A young couple answered the door, surprised but polite when Eleanor introduced herself. I used to live here, she explained. The woman smiled kindly. Oh wow, the previous owner mentioned an older couple before him. Come in if you'd like. We're renovating anyway. Eleanor stepped inside slowly. The smell of fresh paint mixed with something older. A faint echo of the past she thought she buried. Her eyes moved instinctively toward the hallway. Toward the spot where the floorboards creaked slightly under her feet. Her heart pounded. Because suddenly, Daniel's letter didn't feel like a mistake. Felt like a key. With permission from the homeowners, she knelt down near the hallway wall and ran her fingers across the wood. One board looked slightly different, newer nails, a faint gap along the edge. The man handed her a small pry tool. "You think something's under there?" he asked. "I don't know," she whispered. The board lifted slowly. Dust filled the air. And beneath it, a bundle of envelopes tied together with faded blue ribbon. Dozens of them, all addressed to her, all unopened. Her hands shook as she picked them up. Every envelope carried Daniel's handwriting. Dates stretched across years she thought he had vanished without a word. What she discovered next would change everything, because the first letter she opened began with a sentence she never expected to read. "I tried to come home, Ellie, but your father told me never to contact you again." Eleanor sat on the living room floor of the Maple Street house, the bundle of letters resting heavily in her lap. The young couple gave her space, quietly stepping into the kitchen while she untied the faded blue ribbon. Dust clung to the envelopes like a second skin, each one carrying a date she recognized. Years she had believed were empty of Daniel's voice. Her hands trembled as she opened the first letter. "Ellie," it began, "your father came to my job yesterday. He said if I ever contacted you again, he would make sure I lost everything. My work, my freedom, maybe even my life. I don't know what he told you, but I never chose to leave." She stopped reading. The words didn't make sense. Her father had died years ago. A stern, quiet man who believed in rules and reputation above everything else. He had never spoken kindly about Daniel, but Eleanor had assumed it was only disappointment. Now doubt crept into her chest. She opened another envelope, and another. Each letter told the same story. Attempts to reach her, attempts to explain, each one stopped before it could arrive. Daniel wrote about losing jobs, moving from town to town, trying to stay safe while still holding on to the hope that one day she would hear the truth. Her vision blurred. For 40 years she had carried the weight of abandonment, believing she had been left behind by the man she loved. What if she had been wrong? That evening, Eleanor drove home in silence. The letters sat on the passenger seat like a presence she couldn't ignore. Every memory she thought was settled began shifting. Arguments she once blamed on Daniel's distance. Decisions she believed were made out of necessity rather than fear. Her house felt colder when she stepped inside. She placed the bundle on the kitchen table and stared at it as if it might speak again. When Megan called that night, Eleanor hesitated before answering. "Mom, are you okay?" her daughter asked. "I found something," Eleanor said slowly. "Something that doesn't make sense yet." She told Megan about the letters, about Daniel's claim that her father had intervened. Silence followed. "That sounds impossible," Megan said finally. "I thought so too," Eleanor replied. "But why would someone write dozens of letters if they never meant to come back?" Megan exhaled softly. "What are you going to do?" Eleanor didn't know, but she felt something pulling her forward. A need to understand the truth, even if it meant reopening wounds she had spent decades trying to heal. Over the next week, Eleanor read the letters one by one. Some were filled with anger, others with hope. A few were heartbreakingly ordinary. Descriptions of small towns, cheap apartments, the loneliness of eating dinner alone. One letter stood out more than the rest. "Ellie, I heard you remarried. I hope he treats you well. I never wanted to be the man who caused you pain. If staying away keeps you safe, then I'll stay away. But please believe this. I never stopped loving you." Eleanor folded the paper carefully. She thought about Frank, her second husband, about the quiet life they built together. He had been a good man, steady and kind, never asking about the parts of her past she avoided. For the first time, she wondered if her marriage to Frank had been shaped by a lie she never knew existed. A few days later, she visited her brother Thomas. He lived in the same house their father had owned for decades, surrounded by old photographs and familiar furniture that seemed frozen in time. Thomas listened as she explained what she had discovered. His expression shifted from confusion to something darker. "You shouldn't dig into this," he said finally. "Why not?" she asked. "Because some things are better left where they are." The answer made her chest tighten. "Did Dad ever talk to you about Daniel?" she pressed. Thomas hesitated too long before answering. "That was a long time ago," he muttered. Eleanor realized then that her brother knew more than he wanted to admit. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked quietly. Thomas stood and walked toward the window. "Dad thought Daniel was trouble," he said. "He believed you deserved someone stable, someone who wouldn't drag you into chaos." "That doesn't explain threats," she said sharply. Thomas didn't reply. The silence spoke louder than words. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Memories resurfaced in fragments. Arguments with her father before Daniel disappeared. The way he insisted she move back home. For a while. The sudden arrival of divorce papers she never questioned because she believed Daniel had chosen to leave. What if those papers weren't real? The thought made her sit upright in bed. She rushed to the closet and pulled out an old box filled with documents she had never thrown away. Among them was the divorce notice, yellowed with age, signed by a lawyer she barely remembered. Her hands shook as she examined it more closely. Something felt wrong. The signature looked unfamiliar. The date didn't match the timeline she remembered. A cold realization settled over her. What she discovered next might prove that her life had been shaped by a decision she never made herself. The next morning, she drove to the courthouse. Records clerks moved slowly behind glass windows, flipping through archives that smelled of dust and time. After an hour of searching, a woman handed her a thin folder. Eleanor opened it carefully. Inside were copies of legal filings. Her name, Daniel's name, but the signatures weren't hers. Her stomach dropped. She had never officially signed the divorce papers, which meant the life she built afterward might have begun under false assumptions. She sat in the hallway, the world spinning quietly around her, because suddenly the question wasn't just about Daniel. It was about everything that came after, every decision, every marriage, every version of herself that existed because she believed she had been abandoned. And now, she wasn't sure who she had been all along. Eleanor sat in her car outside the courthouse long after she finished reading the file. The divorce had been processed without her signature. A technical loophole signed off by an attorney she barely remembered and approved by a judge who likely never met her. For decades she believed she had agreed to the end of her first marriage. But she hadn't. The realization felt less like anger and more like a quiet unraveling. How many choices in her life had been built on a story someone else created for her? Her phone buzzed. Megan's name lit up the screen. "Mom, you sound different," her daughter said when she answered. "I went to the courthouse," Eleanor replied slowly. "The divorce papers. They weren't signed by me." Silence filled the line. "That's impossible," Megan said. "I thought so too," Eleanor whispered. "But the records don't lie." Megan hesitated. "What are you going to do now?" Eleanor looked down at the bundle of letters resting on the passenger seat. "I think I need to find Daniel." The words felt strange coming out of her mouth, like stepping into a life she had left behind decades ago. Finding Daniel wasn't easy. The return address on the envelope led to a small town 2 hours away, a place she had never visited. She drove there on a cloudy afternoon, the road stretching endlessly ahead while memories crowded her thoughts. What would she say if she found him? Would he recognize her? Would he even want to see her after all these years? The address led to a modest apartment building near a quiet river. Eleanor sat in her car for several minutes, watching people come and go, gathering courage she wasn't sure she still possessed. Finally, she walked to the door and knocked. Footsteps approached slowly. The door opened. Daniel Hart stood there, older, thinner, his hair silvered by time, but unmistakably the man she once loved. For a moment neither of them spoke. He looked at her as if she were a memory that had suddenly stepped into reality. "Ellie," he said softly. Her throat tightened. "I found your letters," she whispered. They sat at a small kitchen table cluttered with newspapers and coffee mugs. Daniel moved carefully, his hands slightly unsteady, but his eyes held the same warmth she remembered. "I didn't think you'd ever come," he admitted. "I didn't know the truth," she replied. She placed the bundle of letters between them. "I thought you left," she said. "Everyone told me you did." Daniel sighed deeply. "Your father came to me after we argued about money," he said. He said I wasn't good enough for you. He said if I stayed, he'd make sure I regretted it. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. Why didn't you fight back? She asked. I tried, he said quietly. But I didn't want to drag you into something dangerous. He had connections, people who owed him favors. I was young, scared, and convinced you'd be safer without me. Tears blurred her vision. I waited for you, she whispered. For months. Daniel nodded. I know, he said softly. I saw you once from across the street. I wanted to run to you, but I thought you'd already moved on. She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the years they had lost because of silence and fear. As they talked, Eleanor began to see Daniel differently. Not as the reckless man her father described, but as someone who had spent decades carrying guilt for a decision he never truly made. What about the divorce? She asked. Daniel frowned. I never signed anything either, he admitted. A lawyer contacted me and said it was already finalized. I assumed you wanted it that way. The room fell quiet. For the first time, they both understood how deeply their lives had been manipulated. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor visited often. They talked about the past, about Frank, about the children she raised alone. Daniel listened carefully, never interrupting, never trying to rewrite history. One evening, as they walked slowly along the river, he stopped and looked at her. I don't expect anything from you now, he said. We're different people. We have different lives. She nodded. I know. But something inside her had begun to shift. Not a return to the past, but a quiet curiosity about what could still exist between them. The true turning point came when Megan met Daniel for the first time. They sat in Eleanor's living room, tension thick in the air. So you're the man Mom never talks about, Megan said carefully. Daniel smiled politely. I suppose so. Megan looked at her mother. I grew up believing he left you, she said. So did I, Eleanor replied. Megan's expression softened as she listened to the story unfold. The threats, the letters, the forged documents. That means our whole childhood was built on a lie, she said quietly. Eleanor felt the weight of those words. Yes, she admitted. But it doesn't erase the life we had. It just means we didn't know the full truth. Later that night, after Megan left, Eleanor sat alone with Daniel on the porch. I don't know what comes next, she admitted. He nodded. Maybe nothing needs to come next, he said. Maybe this is just closure. She looked at him, unsure if she believed that, because for the first time in decades, she didn't feel like a woman defined by what she lost. She felt like someone standing at the edge of a second chance she never expected to have. And what she would discover next would force her to confront not only her father's past, but a secret that had been hidden from her own children for years. Eleanor didn't expect the next revelation to come from her brother. Thomas arrived unannounced one afternoon, standing stiffly on her porch with his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He looked older than she remembered, not just in years, but in the way someone carries a secret too long. I need to talk to you, he said quietly. She stepped aside and let him in. Daniel was there too, sitting at the kitchen table, and the tension in the room became immediate. Thomas glanced at him briefly before turning back to Eleanor. I didn't want you digging into the past, Thomas admitted. Not because you don't deserve answers, but because I was part of it. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. What do you mean? She asked. Thomas rubbed his face slowly. Dad didn't act alone, he said. He believed Daniel would ruin your life. After that argument you two had, the one about money and moving away, Dad convinced himself you were trapped. He asked me to help him keep Daniel away. Daniel remained silent, his jaw tightening slightly. You helped him, Eleanor whispered. Thomas nodded, shame flickering in his eyes. I delivered some of the legal papers, he admitted. And I told people you wanted a divorce. I thought I was protecting you. The words hit harder than any letter she had read. All these years, she said softly. You watched me believe I was abandoned. I thought it was better than watching you struggle, Thomas replied weakly. You had 2 small kids. Daniel didn't have steady work. Dad believed stability mattered more than love. Eleanor sat down slowly, feeling the weight of the truth settle into her bones. Her life hadn't just changed by accident. It had been shaped by choices made for her. That night, she walked alone through the neighborhood, needing space to think. Memories came back in waves. Arguments with her father she never understood. Thomas urging her to move forward after Daniel disappeared. The way everyone insisted she deserved something better. Had she really chosen her second life? Or had she been guided toward it without ever realizing? She thought about Frank. He had been kind, dependable, steady in ways Daniel never was. Their marriage had been built on trust, even if it started from heartbreak. She didn't regret the years she spent with him, the family they raised, the quiet evenings they shared. But she couldn't ignore the feeling that something fundamental had been taken from her long ago. Choice. Daniel waited on the porch when she returned. "You don't have to carry all this alone," he said gently. She sat beside him. "I don't know how to feel," she admitted. "Angry at my father. Angry at Thomas. Angry at myself for not asking more questions." "You were trying to survive," Daniel said. "That's not a weakness." She looked at him. "And you?" she asked softly. "Did you ever stop being angry?" He shook his head slowly. "I did for a while," he admitted. "But anger gets heavy. After enough years, it's easier to let it go." The following weeks were filled with difficult conversations. Thomas apologized repeatedly, though Eleanor wasn't sure forgiveness could come easily. Megan struggled with the new truth too. Her childhood memories suddenly felt uncertain, shaped by a story that wasn't entirely real. One evening, Megan sat across from her mother at the kitchen table. "Does this mean you wish you had stayed with him?" she asked quietly. Eleanor hesitated. "I don't wish away the life we had," she said gently. "You and Caleb came from that life. Frank was a good man. But I do wish I had been allowed to decide for myself." Megan nodded slowly, absorbing the complexity of it all. I understand," she said. Daniel and Eleanor continued spending time together, but something had shifted between them. It wasn't about reclaiming youth or pretending the past hadn't happened. It was about understanding who they were now. Two people shaped by decades of loss, resilience, and quiet endurance. One evening, Daniel handed her a small box. "I kept these all these years," he said. Inside were photographs. Young Eleanor laughing on a summer day, standing barefoot near the lake, her hair blown by the wind. She barely recognized that version of herself. "She looks fearless," she murmured. "You still are," Daniel replied. She smiled faintly, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed him. The emotional midpoint of her journey arrived unexpectedly when Eleanor received a letter from an attorney. Her father had left behind an undisclosed trust, one she never knew existed. The funds had been managed quietly by Thomas for years, intended to support her if she ever faced financial hardship. First, she felt relief. Then something deeper surfaced. Another decision made without her knowledge. Another layer of control disguised as protection. What she discovered next would change everything, because hidden within the legal documents was a clause written by her father himself. A confession that he interfered with her marriage to Daniel not only out of concern, but out of fear that she would move away and leave the family behind. The truth cut deeper than she expected. Her father hadn't just wanted to protect her. He had wanted to keep her close. That night, Eleanor stood in her backyard, watching the sky darken slowly. The letters, the lies, the revelations. They had reshaped how she saw her entire life. But they had also given her something unexpected. Freedom. For the first time, she realized she didn't have to live inside anyone else's decisions anymore. And somewhere ahead, another emotional storm was waiting. One that would force her to confront not only forgiveness, but the possibility of loving again after believing that chapter was long over. Autumn arrived quietly that year, the kind of season that felt more like a long exhale than a change. Leaves gathered along Eleanor's driveway, brushing softly against the porch steps every time the wind shifted. She spent more mornings outside now, wrapped in a light sweater, watching the neighborhood wake up slowly. The letters sat inside a wooden box beside her chair. She didn't read them every day anymore. She didn't need to. Their truth had already reshaped how she saw herself. Daniel visited often, though neither of them spoke about the future in certain terms. What existed between them felt real but delicate, something built from honesty instead of expectation. One afternoon, as they sat together drinking coffee, Daniel broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about whether we're trying to go back, or just trying to understand." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I don't think anyone our age goes back," she replied. "We just decide what parts of ourselves we're finally ready to carry forward." He nodded, relief flickering across his face. Because neither of them needed a grand romance. What they needed was peace. The real emotional break came when Thomas showed up again, this time without hesitation. He stood at the edge of her yard, holding an old photograph, one she hadn't seen in decades. It showed her, Daniel, and her father standing together on Maple Street, smiling as if nothing could ever fracture that moment. "I don't expect forgiveness," Thomas said quietly, "but I need you to know something Dad told me before he died." Eleanor folded her arms, bracing herself. "He said he was wrong," Thomas continued. "He said he confused control with love, and he regretted it every day after you remarried." The words landed softly but deeply. For years she believed her father never questioned his choices. Now she realized regret had followed him long after the damage was done. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the photograph, at the younger version of herself who had trusted that life would unfold honestly. "I'm not ready to forgive everything," she said finally, "but I don't want to carry this anger forever." Thomas nodded, tears filling his eyes. "That's more than I deserve," he whispered. As winter approached, Eleanor faced another truth she hadn't expected. Daniel's health wasn't as strong as he pretended. She noticed it first in small ways, how he paused longer before climbing the porch steps, how his laughter faded into quiet coughs he tried to hide. One evening, after dinner, he admitted what he had avoided saying. "My heart isn't what it used to be," he said softly. "The doctors warned me years ago." Eleanor felt a familiar ache, the memory of watching Frank grow weaker, of learning that love sometimes meant staying present even when time felt fragile. "You don't have to protect me from that," she said gently. "I'm not," he replied. "I just don't want this to become another goodbye you didn't ask for." She reached for his hand. "We don't get to decide how long something lasts," she said. "Only how honestly we live while it's here." The final turning point came on a cold December evening. Eleanor gathered her children and Thomas at the house. She placed the wooden box of letters on the table. "I spent most of my life believing I was abandoned," she said quietly. "But the truth is, I was protected in ways I never agreed to." She looked at Megan and Caleb. "I don't want you to carry that kind of silence into your own lives," she continued. "If you love someone, tell them the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you're afraid." The room grew still. Megan wiped her eyes. "I think we're all learning that now," she said. Daniel sat quietly beside her, not as a replacement for the past, but as a witness to the person Eleanor had become. Weeks later, snow covered Cedar Lake. Eleanor and Daniel walked slowly along the shoreline, their steps leaving faint marks in the fresh powder. The air felt sharp but clear, and for a moment she felt younger, not in body, but in spirit. "Do you regret anything?" she asked suddenly. Daniel thought for a long time before answering. "I regret the years we lost," he said. "But I don't regret this moment. Not 1 second of it." She nodded. "I used to think life was about finding the one perfect path," she said. "Now I think it's about learning how to keep walking even when the road changes." They stood there quietly, watching the frozen water stretch toward the horizon. It wasn't a dramatic ending. It wasn't a grand declaration of love. It was something softer, two people choosing honesty after decades shaped by silence. Spring returned again, and with it came a sense of closure Eleanor never believed she would feel. She turned the Maple Street letters into a small memoir project at the local community center, helping others share their own hidden stories. Widows, veterans, and retirees gathered to write about moments they thought no one else understood. One afternoon, as she read a passage aloud, she realized something profound. The letters hadn't changed the past. They had changed how she carried it. They gave her permission to forgive without forgetting, to love without comparing, to move forward without erasing who she had been. On a warm evening months later, Eleanor sat alone on her porch watching the sunset fade into soft gold. The chair across from her wasn't empty anymore, not in the way it used to be. It held memories of Frank's steady presence, echoes of Daniel's quiet laughter, and the strength she found within herself after learning the truth. She whispered softly into the evening air, "Thank you for the letters." Not because they brought back what was lost, but because they revealed something she never expected to discover at this stage of her life. That even after 60, after heartbreak, after years of believing the story was finished, a new understanding could still begin.